Hello YouTube, today you're going to see the rather tumultuous last bit of the CB550 build. The very first piece of media in this video dates back to June, and the very last is as recent as this week. Now that being said, this one is going to be a little bit different, as given the circumstances it catered a little more to Instagram viewers. So more still images, more stories pulled directly from Instagram, and with some jobs, less depth due to backtracking or honestly cold weather. But I've still pieced this all together in a typical format, so let's jump in and get you up to speed. Hopefully you don't hear the snowstorm going on behind me. We begin where part 6 left off back in the summer of 21. In order to complete the lighting and the electrics of the bike, I would first have to complete the controls. Now as I mentioned, I will be going with the raised handlebar setup for the sake of usability. And that starts with the top triple by Cognito Moto that has holes already precisely drilled into it for risers. Now this idea of using a handlebar setup visually similar to the setup on my former FZ1. So I bought this cheap knockoff bar to just see how it would look, and yeah, moving on from that idea. I decided very quickly to just throw on the original flat bar back onto the bike, which looked way more reasonable. For buttons that will control the blinkers and a horn and a beam, I went with some Amazon 2-button clusters. Now on the BMW, I went with expensive Moto Gadget ones, but here I'm being cheap, or I'm at least trying to be cheap. Honestly, these feel totally fine. They're made out of aluminum, they feel fine to press, and they came pre-wired, so I would buy them again. The 7/8, so they bolt up with no issues, and I was liking the look, but I had to route the clutch cable kind of funky because it's a stock one and it's way too long, and I've since found a shorter clutch cable, but I've only just now ordered it, so I didn't have it at this point. I decided to take it a step further and mount the headlight and the turn signals to see how all of that would theoretically look together. Okay, here's where I had begun cleaning up the harness, tester tape, routing. The goal here was to hide the wires to a reasonable extent, but also make sure that things were easily demountable. Regarding the engine's run stop and the electric start controls, I would have to extend the wires as they were no longer going to run into the headlight bucket, but instead they were going to run down the frame into the main tray. Using heat shrink and wire combinations, I tried to maintain some form of consistency for the wire colors. I really struggled to remember where these wires go because I'm here viewing the footage months later. Green goes to ignition out on the M unit, which sends power to the handlebar switch, just like factory. White and black takes said power from the handlebar switch, and if the switch is in the run position, it sends that power to the coils. Black and red didn't seem to have any use, so I just cut it off short. Purple goes to ground as the signal source for the start input on the M unit. Yellow and red takes the ground signal from purple when the starter button is pressed, and it sends it through the starter button into the start input of the M unit, allowing the start output to activate the starter relay and thus the starter motor. In order to make sure the right bar controls are actually removable, a connector would need to be placed between the controls and the M unit itself. Now you can also see how I loop back the white and black wire to the coils to power them, while also keeping things easily demounted and water resistant. That wasn't done though, because the other part of the ignition system aside from the coils is the points or the crank sensor. Now since I've long upgraded this bike to a modern electronic ignition, I would also have to tap the sensor into this here black and white connector for power. The yellow and blue bullet connectors here will tell the coils when to fire the plugs after getting a signal from the sensor. The points are located on the bottom right side cover of the engine. Now this bike was once on fire due to gasoline on the starter motor, and you can see the wire damage and the roadside repairs that I had to make. Here, I'm cleaning up the wires for good. I removed the gray insulation that was burned and used more heat-resistant tester tape. Now, even though the gray was burned, the real wire insulation was good up until this point. After this, the actual wires were burned and had exposed copper and all that. Now, honestly, I'm not sure why, but Dyna uses black and white wires with little blue and yellow pieces of heat shrink to denote which coil each wire goes to, instead of just using blue and yellow wires. This told me that the white was blue and the yellow was black for those little coil bullets that I mentioned earlier. The two reds just need 12 volt power from somewhere, anyway. And that's going to be the black and white wire connection. Yellow and red equals start input, green equals ignition out, purple equals ground, and that red and black is just cut off and shrunk. At the front, white and black is still powering the junction where the two coils are tapped into, as well as the points, represented by these two red wires. You can also see the blue and yellow bullets up here. Okay, one is orange, but close enough. Every connection here is still easy to reach and demount, being situated in the stock area and also being unharnessed like stock. Everything in the electrical system that's needed to run the bike was now in its final state, so, well, let's hear it run. Now, way back in someone else's hands, this bike was very cheaply converted into a cafe racer, which is why it has a tail hoop that looks like someone just took some leftover steel and went to town on it. If you remember, this bike was supposed to be a more subdued, cheap thing, so I do plan to reuse this, but after a refresh. For now, I just needed to test this taillight and plate holder assembly that I bought. I angled everything to follow the bottom of the seat, and I did a poll on Instagram if I should keep the plate on the side of the bike or center it. Now, most people said to center it, so that was the plan. It was time to tackle the lighting, starting with the left-hand controls. Now, these are momentary ground switches, and therefore, you just have to connect one wire of the button to a ground source and the other to the input of the M unit. I just had to find out which wire was which by using a test light. In this case, the operation of the button completes a ground circuit for the test light, and that lets you know which one is which. So here you can see what I mean, right? 4 buttons and thus 4 wires going to a ground source in the form of this connector right here. And 4 wires go into the respective input on the M unit. The LEDs on the left indicate which button is being pressed. These are for the horn, beam, left and right turn signals. After verifying that the buttons worked, I shortened the wires to clean it all up, and I focused on the brake light input switches. Now, from the factory, this rear brake switch gets positive power through a black wire and directly sends that power to the taillight when you hit the brake through this green wire. On an M unit, it's the same concept, but instead we'll be using negative, or ground, using this connection to the grounded frame. For the front brake light, you just use the 2 wires connected to the switch that every master cylinder comes with, and again, you just run ground through one of them, and you pull the brake, and ground comes out the other one. Here, the test light is hooked up to positive, with ground running through the switch to the needle of the light. Ground makes it to the light when the brake is pulled in. You can see it all works when I hooked it up to the M unit. So once I give the M unit outputs, they'll all work straight away. Right, so outputs. Now I ordered these turn signals, but I didn't realize that they had this annoying setup where the ground for the lights are made through the body of the lights themselves. The implication being that when you attach them to the bike, the chassis will ground the lights. So you can see here, like the nut itself has a ground wire going to it. This is a setup I don't really like because it's not as reliable as just having 2 wires, although it can look cleaner if your headlight bucket isn't made out of plastic. You see the issue here. Here's how it'll look inside of the bucket. I then roughly plugged in all of the outputs and settled on this packaging that you see here, minus the output for the horn because I was still looking for a spare one that I had. And I was happy to see that the tray was able to contain all the wires and everything, but this, my friend, is where the momentum of the build pretty much hit a brick wall and fell off a cliff. See, the last build episode came out on June 27th, 2021. This last pic that you see here on the screen was taken on July 5th, 2021, so the time frame was moving pretty quickly, but the problem is I ran out of money. hard. See, I was struggling to pay bills and also pour money into a project, which really sucked. I mean, it's not like I couldn't eat anything, but there was basically zero room for using money recreationally. The proverbial well had run dry, and I'm such a completionist that I couldn't even bear to look at the bike or even my social media for that matter. You know, when I feel stuck, that's just how I get. Normally, if I take a YouTube break, I'm still active on Instagram at least, but I wasn't even there for about 3 months, which is unheard of. The only thing I posted was that I sold the FC1. Yeah. So let me show you what I posted on Instagram on September 23rd, 2021, after radio silence since July 5th. Hey guys, I reckon it's time to spam an annoying series of updates since I've been dead on here. Sorry for any missed messages and all that. I took a step back. Firstly, if you missed it, I sold my FC1, which was something I was supposed to do last year when I bought the CB and moved out of my family's building. I never did. I just sort of had my cake and ate it too, so to speak. 1 year later, and I found myself more or less bankrupt by renting an NYC apartment in the year it was named most expensive city to live in. As a broke-ass millennial, I was pretty much living check to check. I mean, space was nice, and there were benefits like being in a more fun area of Brooklyn, but towards the end of my lease, I very quickly realized how not worth it was. Ran up my credit cards, bank was lacking, it became hard to even justify running this piece of crap Lancer that I'm running. So I finally sold the FC1 to recoup some funds and decided not to renew my lease. I used the money from the FC1 to pay that last month of rent, and I threw the rest into a credit card. Then I spent the last month and a half working obscene overtime, double shifts, nearly 80-hour work weeks, just going absolutely bonkers for money. That way, once I bounced from the apartment, I could have some semblance of a fresh start when returning to my actual house. Money's rolling in and it feels good to not have to give away a paycheck every month. But yeah, if you want to read the rest of this, you could just pause the video. But to summarize the rest, I decided to put all my furniture, which was quite a lot, into my storage unit with the BMW. So once I actually went back home and I went to start the CB550, it wouldn't fire because all the gas and rust just kind of went gross in the time that it sat there, clogging up the filter, and I confirmed later that it clogged up some of the jets too. So I went ahead and I replaced the filter, which allowed the bike to fire up. Ran pretty damn poorly, but that was the motivation that I needed to jump back into this thing. You can see I do have a jump pack up there on the battery though, and that's because I killed the lithium battery trying to crank this thing over. Prompted me to purchase a 8-cell version of that battery in a deeper electrical tray. Now, I do have a huge epiphany regarding lithium batteries in this episode, so I'll come back to that. It's pretty interesting. Now, I soon began wrenching, but I honestly didn't commit as much to filming for YouTube. Now, don't get me wrong, I did film stuff, which you'll see, but it was all through my phone and less in-depth. Basically, I just had the attitude of let's just finish this bike already. By the way, this was my apartment on the border of Clinton Hill and Bed-Stuy. So if you out-of-town folks want to know what $1,600 gets you in Brooklyn these days, here you go. I think this apartment actually leased for $1,800 to the next person after I left. And next lease, I wouldn't be surprised if this thing hits 2 G's flat, because this city makes no sense housing-wise, so why not? After all, this place had its own bathroom and kitchen. I upgraded my storage unit too, since the old one was a little bit tight. Since I had to move the BMW to another building, I actually rode it for a day or two, which was nice because I haven't done that in a while. Well, here's what the new larger storage unit looked like when I was done. Okay, back to the build, since the first task that I needed to complete was obvious: fuel system maintenance. Now, I've already covered a carb rebuild earlier in this series, which, thinking about it, seems like a long time ago. And on top of that, carbs are still something that I still don't have a full grasp on as far as tuning and adjusting goes, so I didn't bother filming the rebuild again. But remember that the mission statement of this build was to work on a more budget side of things, so I didn't do anything too crazy with the outside of the carbs. This time, I did, however, decide to run some inline fuel filters and clear hoses so that I could keep an eye on the fuel quality. As for the tank, once again, I decided to clean it out with the same method I used before earlier in the series. I used vinegar and bolts to soak for a week, followed by rinsing the tank out repeatedly until all I saw come out was clear water. I put a full tank of gas in immediately and tested out the quality of the gas. It was completely clear and it flowed well. So that was done. I also took off a little bit of surface rust that was on the outside of the tank. With the intake system sorted, I figured I could wrap the exhaust pipes real quick. It helps hide the blemishes until you do get the pipes that you want to run. Doesn't look too bad either, even though this is the best they're gonna ever look. Before installing the tank, it would be wise to finish the electrics. Now, if you recall, I still had a few things to do regarding the electrics before I abruptly stopped the build. It was also due to the fact that I let the electrical tray sit without paint. I had to deal with a bunch of rust that had formed in it, not to mention the fact that I wanted to run a bigger battery now. To start, I had begun replacing the old headlight with the nice LSL unit unit that I bought. The new headlight would hold the same wiring setup as the old one, so I just had to switch the buckets. Cognito Moto failed to give me the mounts that had the holes for the turn signals like I ordered. They gave me the wrong part, so the turn signals also wouldn't fit through the bucket holes either. So I decided that the cleanest and fastest solution would just be to run those Rage 360 turn signals that sit on the fork leg. They're the same ones that I run on the BMW. For my horn, I channeled the Subaru guys with a Hello horn, and for the tack, I'd just be running a simple 12K analog dial. In typical fashion, no speedo. The headlight looked pretty good on a bike, and the horn fit right in too. To be honest with you, I was putting off the job of replacing the electrical tray because I was worried about removing all the wiring that I did after not touching the bike for so long, because I pretty much forgot everything at that point. But I took my time and I just filmed everything at each step. Eventually I got everything out and I repeated the same steps for mounting holes on the new tray. This time I just decided to paint it from the start, masking off the grounding surfaces. The new battery will be an 8-cell, which allows for large capacity. However, the deeper tray it requires is more visible when viewed from the side of the bike, and that's a downside, but I was willing to accept that because this would be the second 4-cell that I drained. Before you comment about that, just wait until my epiphany regarding these damn batteries. I removed the 8-cell for now because when it comes to tests, I would just use my lead acid. The Rage 360 turn signals had arrived, which would join the tack light and the horn as the last things that I needed to wire in. I would have to make the correct connections for all of these things, something like this. The headlight and turn signals, they worked as expected, but soon I began to smell burning. Turns out it was the headlight wires, which I had concluded were way too thin of a gauge for the brand new modern bulb. The old sealed beam unit from the 70s was uselessly dull, so I reckon it wasn't really an issue for that light. Again, this bike nearly burned to the ground, so I wasn't going to play around with fire risk. So I made my own connector with a way thicker wire, and I decided to run one of the LED bulbs that 2J actually had given me some time ago. An LED bulb will be much easier on the wires given their improved efficiency over halogen. The downside is the complexity of the wiring they need, but I wasn't too worried about that because the inside of the headlight bucket had plenty of space now anyway. You have bullet connectors going into the H4 male and female, which are going into the ballast for the bulb, which go into 2 threaded connectors into a cooling fan, into a bulb, but it all fit and performed as expected. For the tack light, I just jacked that into the high beam. That way, if it's night, when I turn on the headlight, it will light up as if I was in a car. Though here, it's just the high beam that it comes on. By this point, all of the lights and horn worked. And here you can see the brake light, but no running light. That's something that you have to change in the phone app, the M Unit phone app, which is something that I eventually do once I connect the phone to the bike. I wasn't worried because I remember that being the case for the BMW. With the electrics finally done, I put the tank back on the bike and immediately realized that those fuel filters weren't going to work, so I had to ditch them. I still hooked up the tank and started the bike, and everything went well for the initial filming. But then, for whatever reason, when the camera was off, the carbs just started overflowing like crazy from the mouth, dumping gas all over the engine and flooding into the cylinders. which, after the flooding, the bike refused to start at all. I'm not a carb guru and I have no clue what went wrong, so I decided to call in some help rather than deal with carb issues. But more on that later. You're gonna like the solution. Undeterred, I turned my attention to the drivetrain. So basically the bike has needed a new chain for a while now, but it's wise to replace the sprockets at the same time as the chain. So I bought a basic roller chain for 20 bucks and a standard size 37 tooth rear sprocket. I also ordered some rear wheel bearings with the logic of, okay, I'm taking the rear wheel off, so I may as well hit the bearings too. For the front sprocket, I went with a PBI 15 tooth, which is down from the stock 17. This will increase the acceleration and the torque feeling at the expense of top speed, a sacrifice I'm willing to make as a city slicker. Now, to get that old completely seized chain off. Yeah, that'll do. While this area was a little bit more exposed, I cleaned it the best I could and I touched up the paint too. Now for the rear sprocket. I got the wheel off and decided to also remove the plate mounts while I was back there. Watch the transformation that this wheel goes through as far as cleaning goes. To make sure I didn't damage or incorrectly install the bearings, I rigged up a way to test them like this, and they definitely passed the test. I then cleaned, wire wheeled, and painted the hardware, brake drum, and the taillight holder. Just like that, everything was on except for the chain. It came as a 120 link chain, and if I recall, I would need to break it down to a 100 link. I think that's the stock length. You start by grinding down a pin at the point that you want to break the chain, and then using the tool to drive the pin out the other side. The master link is what you use to close the loop of the chain, and you move the wheel back until the correct chain slack is reached. Then you close the master link. All the roller chains use these simple clips, so just like that, the drivetrain was done. The more observant viewer may have noticed that there are no mirrors on the bike whatsoever. Well, I picked up these simple bar-end mirrors from Amazon and did my signature single left side mirror thing. I concluded that in order to drop the tack down a little, I could use a bar mount similar to something you'd find on a Sportster, but not as bulky. I also decided to order the same small reservoir that I used on the BMW because this OEM Honda one, A, looked like a pea cup, and B, sat way too high up. Fun fact, even though I ordered the reservoir, UPS lost the package, so to this day I never received it. I ended up having to order a second one. You can see up here that was 2.5 months ago. I had another package with a fair bit of parts that also got fumbled by USPS, more on that later. Since I was now finally sure that the steering would no longer need to be removed, I shortened the steer stops for more turning radius and I torqued everything down to spec to dial in the steering. Amazon one-day shipping came in super clutch and I was even able to remount the tack. I started by mounting it to the left of the risers and keeping it angled forward, which looked better than before, but just wait, I find an even better solution. I know we're jumping around a fair bit, but just keep up and check this out. This was my solution to the carb issues. A 550/500 set rebuilt by a pro, more importantly not me, synced on a 4-to-1 test bike, black powder coated bodies and bracket with zinc plated everything else. All parts were replaced or at least touched. Now they weren't rejetted, so I had to install my 110 mains from my old carbs. Otherwise they all bolt on though. Guy named Carbureted Keith on eBay. They weren't cheap, don't get me wrong, $500 with a core and $700 without a core. I didn't even want to put them on a bike, honestly. This is the best they'll ever look. I started to just look for a standard rebuild service, but I went the extra step for something beautified and also expedited in comparison. They also came with black manifolds, so I plan to use those as well. Like I said, I just installed my 110 jets and the velocity stacks, and they were ready to go. Once the carbs filled with gas, the bike ran like gold. The problem is how nice the carbs look versus the rest of the bike around them. So the bike runs with these carbs, drives with these new drivetrain components, and to ensure that it stopped, I ordered some custom core motor brake lines, and in typical fashion, I got them custom made a little bit too long. The throttle response on this bike has never been so crispy. Remember when the carbs dumped a bunch of gas into the bores? I was a little skeptical of the oil quality after that, so I opted to change the oil right then and there. It was a missed opportunity because remember, I had the pipes off, which would have made changing this filter out a lot easier, but you know, whatever. In fact, you can see the gasoline coming out first right here. The oil itself hasn't really even seen much action, so the color wasn't terribly dark either. But this is due diligence, and I never replaced that filter either, so. Now, one thing that I noticed was the fact that the oil pressure light didn't seem to work when I tested it a while back. Obviously, we had pressure because the engine didn't seize up. With no pressure at all, the switch should be ground in the light, and since the rest of the pump body is grounded, I know the switch is busted. Luckily, I have two spares, so I just picked the better looking one. And boom, it's grounded with no pressure as it should be. Just think of the test light as a big red warning light on the dash telling you no oil pressure. If the engine's off, that's normal. If the engine is running, then that light should go out. While I was down here working with the pump, I decided to wire up an oil pressure light, which I totally forgot to do up until this point. I had a single LED for a few years that sat around because I had no real use for it. This would be a discrete and inline light similar to the charging light that I have on my K100. I inspected the alternator, refilled the engine with some 1040, reinstalled the sprocket cover, which finally added some much needed finish to the appearance of the bike. Then, I finally took the bike for the first ride in a long time. I continued to ride the bike over the next few days, and some problems that came up included dead brakes, which indicated that the rotor was pushing the piston back as the wheel spun. I had an issue of the headlight flickering out, as well as an issue of the key slot for the ignition vibrating into the off position when the bike was revved too high. At first I thought the wheel may have been bent, but I erred on the side of the brakes being an issue. So I replaced the rotors, master cylinder, and the pads. For the electrical issues, I just ordered a new key ignition. When that Friday morning came around, I tried to ride the CB550 to work, but I couldn't get it to start up. Granted, it was a cold morning, so I knew it would be a little bit harder. But with the new carbs, I figured it would be as easy as hitting the button and giving it a little bit of throttle. I killed the 8-cell. So I took my car to work, and I just brought the battery and the charger and a voltmeter with me, so I could charge it there. This was the first time I ever charged one of these batteries with a voltmeter attached. and the volts were not going up at all, despite the charging light on the charger being on. I've been using this charger, so that led me to conclude that my bad history with lithium batteries actually came down to this charger fooling me the whole time. And to add insult to injury, sometimes the charger would even shine the finished charging light. So putting money aside, I opted for the charger recommended by Anti-Gravity themselves. I found this smart charger and next day ordered it on Amazon. I also had to step back and understand what I was doing wrong, because even though I always had issues cold starting when I dailied the bike, back at my apartment, I always chalked that up to the carbs not being in terribly good shape, But this time the carbs were brand new, so it has to be me. And what better place to look than the manual? You couldn't pause to read, but TLDR, you should put the choke all the way on, pump the engine a few times with the kickstart while the key is off, then give it a good kick with the ignition on while modulating the throttle a little bit. If it starts, immediately reduce choke. I personally had written the choke lever off because I just didn't understand how it worked, I realized. Here, I highlight my experience with the choke setting on other bikes, but on a CB, it would just kill the bike. That's because you have to immediately modulate it to a lower setting when the bike fires up, or else it'll just kill the engine. On this bike, the choke closes the air intake, which puts more vacuum on the jets, creating a richer mixture. So there's more gas to burn to start. I was like super eager to try this procedure, but I had to get the battery working first. I went into big detail for Instagram, so again, pause if you want to read, but essentially this computerized charger can save discharged lithium batteries. It succeeded at saving the 8 cell, thankfully, so I used it to save the 2 other 4 cells that I still had, and it saved those too. These are so lightweight that I could carry them around as spares if need be. For the first days of correctly cold starting a bike, I would tend to go overboard with the kickstart pumping, but the more and more I did it, the less kicks I would give, to see what the minimum amount is needed. And pumping the kickstart is also good because you're creating oil pressure. After this start, I went on a joyride, and look how great this headlight is. here's what I mean about the ignition switch. Take a look at that oil pressure light. If it's on, that means that the key is successfully turned because, you know, the whole system's getting power. You can see how it flickers sometimes because the contacts in this key switch have gone bad. In order to turn it successfully, you have to go really slow. And then if the engine revs too high, it'll buzz, and it'll buzz like the key off and kill the engine and kill the whole bike. Now it's replaced with a new one, and that light turns on every single time you turn the key. By this point, I had a big parts haul for the brakes. This is the same Nissan Daytona master cylinder that I'm running on the BMW. A really solid unit for the price, and it's 19mm piston, so it's really good for beefy brakes. Now, I've been running the junkyard pads this whole time, so I upgraded to some new EBCs. I ordered 2 Galfo wave rotors, but at the moment in this video right now, I only received 1 so far. And finally, a new front tire to allow me to put all that braking power to the actual pavement. I wanted to start with the rotor on the side that appeared to have the issue. So you can see how the brakes are pushed back when the wheel rotates, causing the rider to have to pump the brakes to remake contact before braking actually happens. I noticed it on this rotor, so I replaced this rotor first. I also replaced all the pads as well. I was worried that maybe these rotors would be a little bit too flashy for the bike, but I was immediately convinced that these were actually a good choice when I saw the bike. This one rotor change seemed to solve the issue when I would roll the bike, and I planned to wait until I got the other rotor before I changed the tire and the master cylinder because the wheel would have to come off anyway. In the meantime, I tracked down and fixed that flicker and light issue, which was a loose ground bolt that fell out, so I just replaced it. Inspected all the plugs, which didn't look too bad, honestly, and replaced them with some new ones I already had lying around. Tightened up the timing ever so slightly, and after all that, the bike was running super nice. Once the second rotor arrived, I took the front wheel off again and got the new rubber installed and put on a new rotor. Holy hell, was it looking fresh. The master cylinder was looking good too, but I wish they didn't lose that Rizoma reservoir. At this point, a lot of the problems were solved, but there was still one issue of an annoying ticking sound from the top end, which I worked out to be the infamous one rocker cover issue that 550s can often develop. See, the shafts that the rocker arms rotate on can wear into the engine cover itself and start doing weird things. You see the fact that the shaft on the intake side has a big gap underneath the rocker shaft here. That's how much the shaft has dug upward into the cover. You will see exactly what I'm talking about in a sec. But for the duration of this build, I've always wanted to do a 650 camshaft swap for more power. It's just that I was never able to find one for sale. You know, they're kind of unicorns. These two jobs can potentially go hand in hand if I were able to find the right parts. So let me explain, right? 2 months ago, I did some more research into the rocker cover replacement. I learned that Honda had redesigned the rocker shafts and covers for the 1977 and 1978 years in response to the issue, because this was actually well known to happen even back then. I couldn't find an updated cover anywhere, but I did find a 650 cam, which I bought immediately. See, the 550 ended in 1978, but Honda produced a 650 single overhead cam from 1979 to 1982. And that bike had largely the same engine as the 550, albeit with a few changes like displacement, no kickstart, totally different head, but few things bolt on between these bikes, like the camshaft, for example. This is not to be confused with the 1983 and onward CB650, which went dual overhead cam like the rest of the CB bikes going into the 80s. Those cams aren't rare at all because there were so many of those bikes that they built. The single jingle 650 engine can actually be swapped over into a 550 frame, like the entire block, if you want a simple way to make a 550 faster. But anyway, I was just doing a cam. You know, that's like a low budget hot cam. People claim that throwing a 650 cam into a 550 will grant mostly mid-range power and a better sound. To complete the swap, you need the 650 tach drive, as the ratio is different, and a 650 or 750 tachometer with said ratio. As for the cover, I never found an updated 77 to 78 version until this weekend that I'm recording this. So I just ordered an old cover and hope that, you know, the wear was less than the one that I owned. Just for your information, better cam upgrades are available, you know, from Yoshimura or Dyno Man, but you know, once you start doing race cams and all that, you have to change the springs. Now, the rocker shaft problem didn't stop me from enjoying the bike. I actually attended a shop opening party by Brooklyn Speed, which was pretty fun, and afterwards I rode around with Motovelli, another notable rider.
Going into the
It will have to be left.
Yeah. Left on 48 here. 45. I think we go, or we could go straight.
I'd say go straight.
Okay.
Make a right on 48? Make a left.
You said make a left on the 48, but the thing about the streets is 48 streets, 48 Ave. It's still fucking weird.
True, yeah.
So I think we go this way. That's the next way.
Go and make a right?
Yeah. Not this,
well,
not this,
because the tunnel is right there, so...
Yeah, we could ride under it a little bit.
Yeah.
This is the best part about not having GPS. You see the whole city in a whole new way.
Yeah.
You realize how bad your head is.
Right. The fact that it's at night is not helping.
Usually, like, I'll look at my GPS and then I'll write it down.
Yeah. Well, fuck it. I know where we are. I started to realize where we were.
Right.
Yeah.
I got home after that ride, I saw that my heavy-duty new shocks, composite exhaust gaskets, my carb sync tool, and bungee net that came in. This is the package that I was talking about when I said USPS had lost a packet. It finally arrived after going back to Common Motor and then me having to reach out to customer service. They sent it back to me. So I was happy to finally get it, but it took like a month. I'd also finally gotten that custom-made 19-inch spoked wheel that emulates the stock wheel size but can be bolted onto a modern CBR front end. I ordered this a long time ago from Cognito Moto. The reason why I'm not making a huge deal out of this rather lovely wheel is that I actually ordered it on October 1st and it arrived at the end of November. By that point, I had concluded that it would take too much modification to fit. I realized that I would need a new triple tree with more offset for the wheel to clear the exhaust headers under suspension load. The wheel is not specific to a 550, it's just specific to modern CBR forks. So with that said, I could use this on a future bike. I also got a seat latch and locking mechanism, which is something else I ultimately decided against using. So what did I install? Well, those shocks were kind of a must because I was very often bottoming out the original worn out and undersprung shocks, and forget about riding two up, it was just a scrape fest on the inner fender. These also looked a lot fresher. Ain't much to it on these old bikes, just undo the nuts and bolts. So how about something a little bit more involved? Before delving into the previously mentioned cam and rocker cover swap, I made sure to reiterate what was going on here to the Instagram viewers. See, all 550s pre-late 76 have a flaw where the shafts that the rockers rock on may begin to rotate slightly while simultaneously applying pressure from the valve spring. As the engine runs, the movement and pressure of the shafts will eventually wear into the seats of the cover, ruining the cover first and foremost, followed by damaging other valve train components. Here's some words on the topic. They, the engine, will still run a bit longer while in failing condition, however performance will suffer. The shaft holes often don't wear evenly, with one side of the individual rocker shaft wearing faster than the other. This tilts the rocker sideways along the shaft axis and affects how the rocker meets the cam lobe. The tilt transfers all the pressure toward one end of the cam lobe and it wears both cam and follower rapidly, with galling easily seen. If this issue is not caught and corrected early, the lobe wears down, the lift parameter reduces, and the cylinder progressively loses power. Only a little at first, of course. This is in addition to the adjuster hitting the inspection cover. Usually by that time, the cam and rockers no longer meet service specs either. Once again, on someone else's engine, the gap you see here is the shaft wearing upwards into the cover and the other side of the shaft wearing downwards, canting the rocker slightly. The shaft is steel, which beats aluminum. Now here's my engine. Even worse, arguably. The rotation of the shaft when it's not really supposed to rotate is what wears into the cover over time. So how did Honda fix this? Well, here's my cover and one of the 8 rocker shafts up there in my hand. The old style like this one has 1 shaft per rocker for a total of 8 shafts. As such, they are very short. The new style basically combines 2 rocker shafts together, meaning there are 4 double-length ones that will support 2 rockers each. The pink lines up there gives you an idea of what I mean, but that wasn't all they did. They also added studs that drive through the cover and into the shafts to keep them from spinning. This is the cover that I wanted, but these are a lot more rare, and I only just found one. Mine looks more like this. With all that said, I could not find a new cover for sale, so I had to settle on just trying to find an old one that's better than mine. This one looks better immediately because there's much less gap between the shaft and the cover. It was not perfect, but way better, so this would definitely do. Combined with an O-ring trick where you stick an O-ring between the rocker shaft's inspection cover on the side of the head and the shaft itself. They actually apply pressure to the shafts and keeps them in place. Now as for the 650 cam, it looked pretty standard and it came from a quote good running bike. You know, they say sometimes that vintage casting imperfections can cause the cam to snag on the cover, so you should oil it and rotate it around a few times, you know, just to check. And mine seemed fine, but even if it does, you just Dremel the cover ever so slightly where it's gonna hit it. To complete the swap, you need to switch your 550 cam sprocket onto the 650 cam, and that bolts right on. Then, if you plan on running a tack, you need a 650's 4-to-1 tack drive gear, and also a 4-to-1 tack, which is basically any tack marketed as a 650 or a 750 tack. I think it was the next day that I began tackling this job. I started by tracing out a piece of cardboard for the bolt placements on the rocker cover. It would just make things easier for reassembly. I got all the bolts out and placed them in order. Unfortunately, it went from stupidly cold to also stupidly snowing. Luckily, there was plenty of work to be done inside though. Now, upon inspection of the rocker faces, the one rocker that was associated with the like seriously canted shaft also had some serious wear on it. It was beyond saving, but it was nice to know that I prevented more damage down the line. There was another one that had some bad pitting, but not as bad. The rest were okay. After that, I went out and I got the camshaft itself. Remember, I need the 550 Sprocket for this swap. The cam definitely suffered a little bit of wear, but I think it might be serviceable. I don't know, but I just stashed it anyway. It was far from unscathed though. Okay, now you're looking at the 650 cam. That's what's going into the bike. I gave it a wash so I could inspect it. It looked completely fine, so I started the disassembly and the cleaning of the rocker cover. To remove the shafts, all you gotta do is just throw a bolt into the ends and then you pull them out. I got the cover pretty damn clean, and I decided that it would be a good idea to throw some quick paint on it while it was apart. Not that great, but not too bad either, with the silver accents. It was a little bit hard to prep and paint in below freezing weather. For the tack drive, you just remove the housing and you switch the gear, and that's it. The cam has corresponding splines that make this connection and spins a cable that's connected to the tack. With all that done, it was time to go back to the bike. When reinstalling the camshaft, you have to make sure that the timing is set correctly. I covered this in a previous episode, but basically you just have to make sure that this notch on the cam is parallel with the surface on the engine. That's when the crank is at TDC for pistons 1 and 4. Now this is one of those things that you double check because it's possible to be a tooth off here on the sprocket. The only acceptable position is perfectly parallel, and you can shimmy the chain around to dial it in before bolting the sprocket on. Honda recommends using rubber bands around the tappets to avoid bending valves if they happen to make contact with the valves incorrectly. This holds them up so they don't snag and you start torquing down on it. So I just grabbed my cardboard template with the bolts and put them back in, adjusted the valves, and started the engine. And it ran totally fine for a while, except in throttle and everything. I go to film it, and then, listen for yourself. Okay, so that was November 29th, and immediately after those videos, the engine just abruptly stopped, like clink, clink, clink. Uh-oh. See, that set off a chain of events, but I held it close to my chest because when things go wrong, I like to be able to present a solution before people end up worried and thinking hard about it. But it certainly would be odd to see a builder put an engine back together and not show it running immediately after, considering I was doing live updates this whole time. Nonetheless, I waited till the 5th of December to finally make a new Instagram story. I just started by letting people know that I finally ordered the exhaust that I had planned to run. It was the Carpi Yoshibira replica exhaust, similar to the MotoGP works exhaust, but cheaper. And I went with the bronze ceramic coating for the finish in an attempt to do something different. I had also found the new old stock Gary Dixon rear sprocket with a 42 tooth count compared to 37 stock. I then ended the story out with a bit of a teaser of the big problem that I encountered, but it was 3 weeks later that I actually followed up with an explanation, which was around Christmas and my birthday. What was the big clink in the silence afterward? First, I had to establish that by this point, the CB550 was running and driving totally fine. I was able to confirm that the specific tapping that I was hearing had gone away, and I was able to segue into the explanation through the fact that some smoke was leaving the exhaust on this video right here. The final steps of putting the top end back together, when I was swapping the cam, I pulled a really goofy move. The bike started and ran just fine, as you saw. I even took the bike for a quick test ride, and it was fun as ever. But shortly after, the bike started making a really concerning noise, eventually leading to the engine just stopping then and there. I go to restart it, the starter won't turn. So this tells me that the motor is locked up somehow. I pull the rocker cover back off to reveal a cam sprocket no longer connected to the damn cam itself. Further inspection also shows that the cam itself is snapped at the mounting bracket. It was a clean break, as you can see, so I kept the cam for the possibility that it can be professionally fixed. Remember the guy that decked the cylinder head for me, Clayton? If I ever go back to him, I'll ask his opinion. It's fine because I actually found another 650 cam on eBay, luckily, and I ordered it. But if it is possible and also advisable to fix this cam, I would like to save it. This catastrophe was ultimately caused by a failure to torque down the two sprocket bolts enough. The bolts look like this. They were whole, but the threads were completely destroyed. And the noise was actually the loose sprocket kind of clanging around in there. Luckily, everything broke off pretty clean and didn't launch a bunch of metal pieces into the bottom end. Working outside the way I do is pretty mind scattering. I'm in and out, I'm cold, I'm trying to make sure my tools and parts don't get stolen, I'm trying to beat the sunset, sometimes the rain. It's hard to enjoy, and sometimes I miss stuff. This time, big consequences, just from two little bolts. So anyway, the new replacement cam comes in, as well as the sprocket. The original sprocket actually didn't appear to be damaged, but I figured that I may as well replace it. I drop the cam in, go to adjust the valves, and for some reason my rockers could barely reach the valves, which confused me. And I'm sure the experienced engine guys called it before they even reached this part. You should never have to adjust your valve tappets down this far, which was the first clue. So with great fear, I did a compression test and had zero compression across all 4 cylinders. So yeah, I pulled the head, and when the cam jumped timing for the split second that it got disconnected while the engine died, the pistons beat the ever-loving shit out of the valves. You can see how the dishes of the valves are lifted up and off-center when it's supposed to be like perfectly flat inside the ports. Every single one got slapped, and you can actually see the rash where they did too. The pistons were fine, thankfully, but I certainly saw how deep the rabbit hole went. At that point, I'm just weighing options, leaning towards the quickest ones. These valves alone are stupidly pricey, and I'm kind of worried about the seats in the head. I didn't know if the head was ruined or not. I'm also tired, just in general. I didn't really want to work on this bike anymore, to be honest. I was looking to patch it up by just bolting on a good head with good valves and good seats, and just moving right along. I caught a rebuilt head on eBay. Now it's in the Netherlands, but it's the only head on eBay that doesn't look like complete shite. It was $350 shipped with a head gasket included. So I pulled the trigger, and I would just take my original head and maybe use it for hop-up parts down the line. You can see I ordered it on December 5th, but nearly a month later while writing that story, the package hadn't even left the Netherlands. So anyway, I'm left here, waiting with nothing to post on here, and then unrelated, I smashed my phone screen a little later. So I've been using a work loaner with no allowance for Instagram. On the 11th of December, I ordered a replacement phone screen, but the problem is that it shipped out of Kentucky, and due to the tornadoes, it was pretty rough down there. So the package got delayed and marked delivered 2 days from when I wrote this Instagram story, even though it was never delivered. And finally, it just kind of randomly arrived, and that's what allowed me to finally post stories in December. It was on the 20th of December that I finally gathered the will to break down my cylinder head. I was mainly worried about cracked guides and damaged seats, but it turned out that the bends in the valves were actually not as bad as they could have been. The bends were near the dish as opposed to up near the shaft. I mean, they're still garbage, but it seemed that they didn't really do any damage to anything else upon inspection. When I learned that, I decided that I would just buy any old crusty CB550 head and just use the valves in it after I clean them up, of course. That's actually cheaper than buying valves straight up, funnily enough. I found this one and I got to work. Then, as if things weren't going bad enough, I actually got blindsided by COVID on my birthday. Yeah. And I was supposed to go see Spider-Man, which I still haven't even seen yet. So how did COVID go for me? I woke up in the morning with sniffles, took a nap that my body refused to let me get up from, finally woke up but could barely keep my balance to walk. I was slurring with my speech, and my whole body just hurt like crazy. Honestly, I never felt so sick in my life. It felt deadly, so I knew that it was the Rona. Made it back to sleep, woke up at 2 a.m. covered in sweat. It felt so good, so normal that I was actually able to literally go downstairs and finish reassembling the head. Then later that day, I actually reinstalled it. From then on, I just had a sore throat, but I couldn't return to my job due to quarantine rules. I basically took an impromptu vacation, I guess. The smoke that was coming out of the exhaust was the assembly lube being burnt away out of the exhaust since I reassembled everything. So I had to put oil in the cylinders. The sprocket still needed to be installed. The Dutch head still hadn't been marked as on the way, at least. And I had a pipe dream of not spending any more money on this bike. Yeah, okay. Right, so this sprocket, it went on without incident. But I also had to change the chain because the original length was obviously not going to be enough for this giant sprocket. Now I foresaw that, and I ordered a gold chain since old roller chains for these bikes are like 20 bucks a piece anyway. Now by this point, my vlogging setup was entirely in pieces, so I used my phone real quick to show that the bike was actually driving. I took it super easy out of fear because that's the jumpiness that engine failure will leave with you. I torqued and Loctited the sprocket bolts and still was pretty concerned. Now holding the phone was kind of sketchy, so I decided to place my phone in my pocket and record what the bike sounds like when I give it more beans. These clips are numbered, but that's only for the sake of organization. This is all the same muffler that the bike has had forever, that chrome Mac muffler. Take a listen how the upgraded cam and the new gearing setup has changed the character of the bike. Every run never exceeds 7,000 RPM or half throttle, as I still wanted to take it somewhat easy. In between runs, I gave my thoughts, and you're welcome to pause the video and read them as they show up on screen. Again, I have to apologize for the lack of video. So yeah, the bike was running pretty good. Some chain noise, but I was back in business for sure. To close the loop on the Dutch head, it randomly showed up at 7 a.m. even though the tracking still said that they don't know when it will show up, or it had even left Netherlands, but you know, weird, but whatever. I just rode the bike every so often, but around the new year, it was pretty much fully cold with rain and snow. There wasn't much that I really could do. I was convinced that this point here would be where I would post the build video on YouTube, but honestly, I wasn't terribly satisfied with this being a stopping point. See, after a while, my idea was to make this episode the last build episode, so as to not drag the series out. But even with that in mind, I couldn't not install the exhaust system that I had just received surprisingly in early January. couldn't install it immediately as I needed crush gaskets, but I was definitely surprised by the burnt bronze color because it exceeded my expectations. But again, despite how much I wanted to finally get something out for YouTube, I couldn't not install these nice new pipes. So I figured that while I was ordering those gaskets, I should probably order that reservoir again. I even replaced the side panels because I felt that they might look better with the stock seat. But very shortly after this, the brown pipes actually inspired me to purchase this low profile brown seat, even though the stock seat is ridiculously comfortable. So here's how the exhaust swap went. Overall, you can definitely see that there was some oddities with this exhaust when it came to installation. It's nice, but I guess there's a reason that it's cheaper than the GP exhaust, right? I don't know. As far as the reservoir goes, I used the bar clamp that the second tachometer came with, and it did the trick. So what now with this bike? Well, unfortunately, I decided not to do a sound clip yet because I wanted to remove the rocker cover and change out the timing chain as it was making a ton of noise. I was happy to see that the sprocket was still attached when I took the cover off, but there was almost variable valve timing levels of slop on the chain. Now, I had a brand new timing chain sitting around ready to install, so I figured I could swap it out on the next day. It snowed a little, as I feared, but not terribly. So I started by grinding down a pin on the old chain and using a chain breaker tool to split it, and then I used a piece of wire to run the new chain around the engine as I cranked it over. Now I was successful, but before linking the new chain together, I noticed that this chain guide in the front side of the engine was bent backwards about 40 degrees from vertical. Now that totally jives because the chain was most noisy after the catastrophic engine failure. I didn't feel too unlucky about having replaced the chain though, because it was probably stretched from such force that was put on it anyway, you know? So the next move is to replace that guide, link the chain together, and while I'm at it, I'm also going to get a new tensioner as well. Basically replace everything because I'm really tired of backtracking at this point. I really am. I've taken a bike to my work site and I plan to work on it indoors so I don't have to deal with the terrible cold and snow we're dealing with outside right now. I'm honestly over working outside. I've ordered the chain tensioner and guide, a shorter clutch cable, and that seat, but the seat is from Vietnam, so it might take up to a month to arrive. I even managed to find and order a 1977 to 1978 rocker cover that I was blabbing on about. But once those final pieces are received and sorted out, and the ground is dry, I plan to do a comprehensive press-style review of the bike. Until then, you have my word that I'll find other things to make videos about. I just had to get this video out, as people kept rightfully asking when the next video will be. So the pressure was really on between getting this video out and actually finishing the bike. But yeah, this has been the final episode of the CB550 build. You just watched the illustrator, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for sticking around.